AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Those of you who watched last week's show may recall that toward the end of the show, John said, "What is your prediction?" And the prediction had to do with the UAW strike. And I made the prediction that we would not do another show that was totally dedicated to the UAW and the strike. And not entirely because John's not here today, but just because the strike has been settled, we will not be talking about the strike extensively today. So I want to bring in some very, very smart journalists that I know that will be joining us today. So we have Nancy Dunham of Wards, who covers retail quite extensively. We have Damon Bell, senior research editor at cars.com. And we have our old friend Doron Levin, who is clearly one of the deans of automotive business journalism. I'm not kidding.
That's what they say just before they kick you out. You know, they give you a lifetime achievement award, and there's the door over there.
All right, but we'll keep you at least for the show, and then
at least for the show,
and then maybe you can see the door. Okay, so our special guest is Brian Finkelmeyer, who is the Senior Director of New Vehicle Solutions at Cox Automotive. So welcome, Brian.
Yeah, Gary, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And I think that we need to level set. So please explain to the audience what it is that you do there at Cox Automotive.
Yeah, great question. So I joined Cox Automotive just about 9 years ago, and quickly recognized that Cox really sits at the center of the automotive ecosystem. We know we have so many relationships with dealers, with lenders, with automakers, and I'd say that when I describe what I do to people outside of the industry, as I say, we kind of have our hands in all different aspects of the auto business. And so what I actually work on at Cox Automotive today is we have worked on pulling together all of our data assets that we collect from Manheim Auto Auctions to shopper data that we see on our properties like Kelley Blue Book and Auto Trader and all the other host of solutions that Cox Automotive provides out in the marketplace. And it really provides us with this really amazing view of the market where we can see supply, demand, and price in near real time and help advise our clients on how best to maximize their performance.
Okay. So I'll start out with a question, then the others will join in. So I read a piece that you wrote, and you titled it "Volume is for Vanity, Profit for Sanity." And you looked at Stellantis in the U.S. versus Hyundai Kia in the U.S. So tell us about what you wrote about and what your conclusion is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's like the age-old dilemma in the car business is, are we going for volume or are we holding for growth? In fact, we used to say to dealers that, that there was merit and wisdom in being a volume dealer, right? We always, the old ex-factory guy, we didn't really care as much about the growth as we did about the dealers that sold a lot of cars. But I think, in that particular piece, it was just interesting to see the extent to which Hyundai and Kia have had a really remarkable run here over the last couple of years. They've really gained market share, and I think certainly during the microchip shortage, those certainly Hyundai fared a little bit better than some of the other Asian competitors, and I think that Kia has done an absolutely amazing job over there of kind of reshaping their brand and really elevating their brand with the products like the Telluride and the Sportage. They've attracted a whole new level of clients that are coming into their brand. And so, but when you kind of peel back the onion and look at, they've had a remarkable improvement in terms of market share and volume, but a lot of that actually happens more in the $35,000 to $40,000 price range, where when you looked at the Stellantis brands, Jeep in particular, that has become a very expensive franchise. I mean, a lot of these Jeeps now are up over 60, 70. I think they have a Grand Wagoneer that's up near $100,000 vehicle. And so I'd just say that, although Hyundai and Kia had improved their share significantly, profit is the goal. And I think that Stellantis still far and away really shines in that light.
So let me ask you though, that if I'm looking at the sales numbers for these companies, Stellantis, for the Jeep brand, calendar year to date is down 9%. Now, I mean, they got a lot riding on it. And if you're down 9%, doesn't that really attenuate the possibility of achieving this profitability?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt you need to keep the wheel turning, otherwise you're going to go out of business, right? And I do think that is an interesting situation. I know you said you didn't want to talk about the UAW strike, but it did strike me over the summer months as we analyzed and watched these car manufacturers very closely. It was very clear that the Stellantis brands had a rising day supply. Their inventories were some of the highest in the industry. And I did wonder to myself if Tavares and the team there at Stellantis were not strategically doing that is a way to sort of stunt the impact of a potential labor strike. And so I don't know whether or not that was their strategy, but on paper, it looked that way to me, that they were purposely amping up production over the summer months to try to mitigate the impact of the strike.
So by the way, the strike is fair game. The last few shows we've been doing wall-to-wall coverage. So
could I ask a question about Brian, about the Jeep and the fact that the sales are down? To what extent do you think that the Bronco franchise is cutting into Jeep? When I first saw these Bronco models coming from Ford, it seemed to me as a very direct assault on that franchise that Jeep kind of had to itself for quite a while. And now everybody's running into it. And I'm just wondering if Jeep is falling back simply as a competitive issue.
Yeah, I'm sure that absolutely has played a role in this. But I think perhaps the bigger challenge there is just that we're in a new environment, right, where these interest rates and the cost of borrowing money to pay for these expensive vehicles has become just really startling to say. The average new car payment in America today runs around $780. The average used car payment's around $565. It wasn't that long ago that the average new car payment was only $525. So we're in this new world order where the cost of a used car monthly payment is actually higher than the cost of what a new car used to be. So I don't know specifically to what extent the Bronco has eaten away at some of that Jeep share. I would suspect certainly to a certain extent it has. But I do question the impact that Jeep is having in an environment where their prices are effectively luxury level prices in an environment with very high interest rates. I'm sure that has absolutely had some created some headwinds on their retail.
Sure, and that makes sense that they would, over the number of years, make Jeep into a kind of a semi-luxury franchise, which it never was. It was a very pedestrian franchise back in the day, and little by little, the vehicles have become much more premium, better materials, bigger engines, a lot more glitz connected to them, and that would, as you're saying, put them out of the reach of some buyers today because of high interest rates.
And one thing that's really interesting, Doron, is that during the strike, the last 6-8 weeks, the inventory level of the Grand Wagoneer has actually increased from what it was at the beginning of the strike. So I think that speaks to the fact that as we've fallen in here to the fall of the year, and I think there's certainly some trepidation in the economy with everything that's going on, that there's less consumers that are out looking to spend upwards of $100,000 on their next Jeep.
Nancy, jump in there.
I was going to talk about the Grand Wagoneer for a minute, because even in the depths of the chip shortage, it seemed that those were going like hotcakes, used and new and so forth. And I want to go back to the thought about the Bronco. Certainly, when you look at the proliferation of trucks, SUV, that's what everybody wants. And the Jeep is sort of just another I hate to say toy out there for people to enjoy versus a sedan and so forth. I wonder, Brian, if you see the any shift, because you're talking a lot about the high interest rates. We all know that auto lenders, some of them are getting out of the business, certainly in direct lending. And just again, the consumer confidence. Do you see any kind of shift that may take place? What I'm thinking of is SUV, truck versus sedan, a smaller economy car, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting that it wasn't that long ago that we lived in an auto industry where, the Accord and the Camry were the perennial number 1 and 2 sellers, and they would kind of compete every year. And, 50% of vehicle sales in the United States were sedans. And now we're in an environment where it's 80-20 truck SUV, which is at this exact moment that we're trying to reduce greenhouse emissions and trying to produce more fuel efficient vehicles, that the United States consumer has never been more thirsty for gas guzzling vehicles than they are today. So it's an interesting contradiction that's happening all at the same time. But I would say just last 2 comments on Jeep and the expensive price of vehicles. It's interesting if you look at the mix of sales based on price of the vehicle. Today, almost 38% of today's auto sales are over $50,000. I mean, $50,000, it wasn't that long ago, it seemed like a pretty expensive car. Now almost 40% of sales are happening above that price point. And then there's another sort of byproduct that's come along with that, which is that if you look at household income and what percentage of the total industry volume they represent, about 5 years ago, households making over $250,000 a year, which was kind of the high end of this analysis, they only represented about 4% of TIV. Last year, they represented 16% of TIV. Wow. And so the bread and butter of America, kind of let's say the middle or upper middle class making roughly $100,000, $125,000 a year, those families have come down in terms of their contribution to total industry volume, while the families making $200,000, $250,000 and above continue to grow their consumption of new car vehicles. And so what we've clearly seen, certainly since the microchip shortage and COVID, was that pre-COVID we were pacing, upwards of 17 million units a year. The New World Order looks like it's closer to 15 million, but at a much, much higher mix than what we previously sold.
Damon.
So one thing that at Cars.com editorial we are really steeped in these days is just the topic of affordability. And yeah, Brian, what you were saying about the average transaction price, the thing that I'm curious to see in these next couple years is, from a product level, what are OEMs doing to address that? And the 2 vehicles currently on the market that stand out to me in that regard are the Maverick and the new Chevy Trax, and also the Buick Envista, because all 3 of those vehicles seem to have been conceived with affordability kind of baked in from the start. And especially we're not through with the effects of COVID just yet, because the thing that still has yet to play out is the disruption to the used car market, because with that supply chain issue it's already happening now. For the next couple of years, there's going to be a dearth of used vehicles available to purchase, which is going to push consumers to buy new when they would, or settle for a much older used vehicle. So I think moving forward, that affordability issue and OEMs having product there that is comfortably below $30,000 is going to be more important than ever.
Yeah, so a couple of comments there, one of which is, when you analyze the day supply or the available inventory relative to sales at the different price buckets across the industry, it's those segments that are 25,000 and below have the tightest inventory, the fastest turn. I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying. And we noticed as we were monitoring that Chevy Trax, that vehicle's launch was very successful, and they are doing very well with that vehicle. I'm sure that Mary Barr and the team over there at General Motors is very happy. And now, granted, they're not getting the grosses that they enjoy on the Silverados and the big trucks and SUVs, but certainly, to your point, that is capturing a piece of the market where we've got the average price of a used car now, roughly $27,000, is pricing many consumers out of the market. So they're looking for those more affordable, fuel-efficient options to meet that end of the market for sure.
So Doron, let me ask you a question, sort of in keeping with this. So the Maverick is made in Mexico, and the Trax and the Envision are made in South Korea. So to what extent do you think that plays into the affordability of these vehicles? And although I said I wasn't going to talk about the strike, I'll have to talk about the strike. To what extent do you think that the new UAW contract may make more vehicles like that come in here?
I think that the contract is going to push the automakers to put more production overseas. I don't think that they can afford to keep expanding production here with the cost of production going the way it is, not only because of the wages themselves, but everything having to do with union contracts just makes production more costly, and they have to keep cars within the grasp of the consumer. So I think you're going to see, I'll be interested to see whether any Detroit producer in the next 4 to 5 years builds a new plant or expands a plant in the United States. I think it's going to happen in Mexico. It's going to happen in South Korea. It might happen in other places in Asia. And then these vehicles are going to be brought here, depending on the tariffs, of course. But I think that's an obvious strategy for them to keep affordability strong. One of the things that Detroit really has in its quiver is the full-size pickup truck market, which is protected by a 25% tariff. So that's not going to work for Silverados, and that's not going to work for Rams, and that's not going to work for F-150s, but it is going to work for smaller vehicles and smaller SUVs and crossovers for sure.
Anybody else have a comment on that? All right.
I'm just interested, this is a little off topic, but I'm just interested to see, you have the people, and I incorrectly called them toys, but I think of the big trucks sometimes as that, because so many dealers tell us they'll get trade-ins in or they'll get them in for service, and it's obviously no one has used the bed. I mean, I have a couple neighbors that have that. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it shakes down too with all the talk about climate and EVs and so forth. Because, and I don't want to get into an EV conversation, but you brought up an excellent point with the Bronco. That's a fun car. It looks great. It's not the big Hummer, but one would think it'd be more climate friendly. So it'll be interesting to see how the two sides, the flashy, bigger Silverado, Ford, and so forth, versus the Bronco and other ones are embraced by I'll just call them the leisure drivers, the daily drivers.
I've always been struck by what I believe to be true, which is that when people are surveyed and asked if the climate is important, they'll always say yes. But when they go to buy a vehicle, it doesn't really happen. You see that the people and the consumers really still love big vehicles. They love trucks. They love horsepower. They love all of that stuff. If you force them to admit that what their real priority is, I think the real priority is having a vehicle that speaks to them, as opposed to having a vehicle which is necessarily good to the climate.
I think that's an excellent point. I've had younger buyers say to me, gee, why don't they make muscle cars anymore? Why don't they make this? Why don't they make that?
Because the government won't let you do that anymore. That's why.
So Brian, getting back to this issue of affordability, and because of COVID, because of the chip shortage, because of the supply chain issues, it seemed that the automakers all said, hey, we've got to use our resources where we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. Therefore, what we'll do is we'll make these, these very expensive full-size SUVs, and we'll put the other vehicles on the back burner, and maybe we'll never see the back burner again. Do you think this is a good long-term strategy for them to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the shareholders of these companies certainly have enjoyed the margins over the past few years. I mean, this has been a remarkable run where you take the average MSRP was at 35 grand, and now we're at 48 grand. So we've added, I think I did the math one time, something about $200 billion worth of just incremental mix, which is all very profitable money when you're selling a richer mix of vehicles. So I think that's been a blessing for the automakers. And then on the flip side, they simultaneously were able to cut incentives from, at one point, we're up over 10% of sticker was the prevailing incentive. I think it bottomed out around 2%. Today it's back up around 4.5. So still we're at, roughly half of the incentive spend that we were at prior to the pandemic. So I think from the automaker standpoint, these are pretty good times. But it is interesting that here just in the last quarter, and obviously the entire broader S&P 500 is down 9%, but General Motors is off 25, 28%. Ford is off something similar to that. Stellantis is down 9-10%. And so it's interesting to me that Wall Street sort of looking forward, and I'm sure some of this is a result of the labor contract. Some of this, I think, is also the result of Wall Street's concern about this transition to electrification. So it's just wild to think that the big three automakers have shed about $35 billion collectively of market cap in the past quarter. In the same time period, Tesla's market cap evaporated about $200 billion. And so I think that it's just an interesting moment in time that, as my dad used to tell me, anytime in life something seems too good to be true, it usually is. And so maybe there's a little bit of change winds happening here, where we had this incredible run where dealer profitability was through the roof. OEMs are making a lot of money. And it feels like here a culmination of different things is kind of making the future look a little bit murkier here, certainly in the short to midterm.
Certainly, the headlines with regard to debt are very scary coming out of Washington in terms of all of the debt issues that we face. And those of us who remember 2008, 2009, and the difficulty of refinancing debt are, I think, justifiably concerned that it might not be the time, some of us, to buy a new vehicle, and that might be what's happening.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, and I agree with you, but it's just when you go back to the beginning of 2023, more than 50% of the economists were forecasting a recession. Like, based on their crystal ball, we should already be in a recession, which never happened. And Cox Automotive, not unlike many other major companies that analyzes the car business, had a forecast for the year of about 14.1 million units. So certainly a conservative view, I think, of the market. In the first half, we came in at about 15.5, 15.7, really much, much stronger than what we anticipated. And even here in October, where sales were down just a bit, they were actually up year over year, but down a little bit from the previous months, we still were at about a 15 million unit industry. So I would say that even though there's all these kind of reasons for caution, I just think there was so much pent up demand coming out of the microchip shortage and COVID that we're still kind of working our way through that. And, a lot of American consumers have got still a significant amount of cash in their savings accounts, a lot of home equity, and they have the wherewithal to go out and buy vehicles with cash and not have to borrow the money. And we've seen definitely a big uptick in that, as well as that the percentage of cash buyers is at least double what it was before the pandemic.
Well, if you follow economics, obviously you have to follow trends with regard to debt, and you have to pay attention to consumer attitudes, and you have to pay attention to spending and GDP. But usually what precipitates this is an event, something that scares people. I know that in 2008, September 2008, the failure of Lehman Brothers was one of these outside events that really caused what everybody said was going to happen, but wasn't happening in 2007 and 2008. And people were kind of waiting for the collapse and waiting and saying, well, maybe it isn't going to come. And then boom, Lehman Brothers failed. So, the thing is that it never comes with something that you expect. It comes from something you don't expect, a war in the Middle East, something that happens that really just scares people and stops them from spending, because they say, well, maybe my job's at risk, maybe my house is at risk, maybe, my kids' college tuition is at risk. I better pull in my horns. And that seems to happen collectively. So nobody likes that to happen, but history teaches us that it always does happen.
Damon, you mentioned that you guys at cars.com are looking, at affordable products. Are you finding that this seems to be what people are looking for versus the upper trim models?
Yeah, it's we have a lot of articles that are roundups of cheapest EVs on the market, cheapest new SUVs on the market, and those are always perform well traffic wise. So that tells us there's definite consumer interest in affordability. We recently had a 6-vehicle shootout of SUVs. They're basically subcompact SUVs that all hit around the $30,000 mark. And it was funny in that the Kia Seltos was the winner of that. The vehicle that came in third was the new Chevy Trax. Interestingly, those two vehicles tied for in the best value category. And the Seltos was a top trim level, the most expensive vehicle in the shootout. I think it was around $35K. And the Trax was the cheapest at 26. So that in a nutshell is a little interesting snapshot of the different ways to kind of tackle value. And traditionally, Hyundai and Kia's strategy, ever since I've been in reviewing new cars, is to offer a ton of features for the money. And the rest of the stuff, they've been catching up incredibly in terms of all other measures. And then their prices have been creeping up along with that too. So again, I'm very interested to see what new vehicles will be coming out to address that affordability issue moving forward.
Brian, do things like that perhaps put the traditional three at some risk, again, because of their concentration on the top end and letting, Hyundai, Kia, Toyota, Nissan, Honda have vehicles at various price points?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the domestics are not exactly dying to say, oh, I wish I had way more market share in the low end of the market. I think they enjoy selling big trucks and big SUVs that bring with it big profits. I mean, I would imagine that on a big GMC Sierra, their margin would be the equivalent of like 3 Honda Civics. So I'd rather probably sell one GM Sierra and make all the money than have to sell 3 Honda Civics, although you could argue that Honda benefits from having 3 more Honda customers out on the street. But I don't think that there's anybody in Detroit that's really necessarily worried about their mix being skewed too rich. I think the big concern in Detroit right now is how are we going to be able to make money on these electric vehicles where we've deployed an absolutely insane amount of capital has been dedicated to building these new EV plants and battery plants. And where right now, as we've seen, there's just very, very tepid consumer interest outside of Tesla. And even Tesla, even with these big price cuts, they are not really seeing a huge uptick in volume. I mean, they continue to cut price, but their quarterly sales have remained relatively flat.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I know Doron is going to want to go off on Tesla at some length here. So before he does, I want to take a quick break here and give a shout out to our sponsors, BorgWarner and Bridgestone. So we'll be back, and Doron will just launch.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on wet roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
All right, and we are back, and I promised that I was going to let Doron get carried away here, but we're going to put a pause on that, and Nancy has a question for Brian.
Thank you so much for letting me horn in here.
Oh, not at all. And I'm hoping that the rest of you, when Doron gets carried away, I want you to put a stop to it. So just
I've wanted to ask you, Brian, and again, I'm not talking about Tesla or EVs at this point. I'm just talking about the whole worldview of this. One thing that was interesting, Wards has done a lot on inventories at the dealerships, and certainly Cox has done quite a bit. CDK is quite published quite a few studies and so forth on it. And one thing that we've seen is certainly the best-selling cars, can't get those, but we've got some of the smaller cars you were alluding to. The Detroit 3 aren't as excited, if you will, about the smaller cars. So I guess my question is, with the UAW strike, with Detroit 3 saying, really consumers are going to pay for this probably, because we're probably going to have to raise prices. Do you see incentives going away, at least for the near future?
No, I think that incentives is the easiest lever that any automaker pulls when their inventories get out of whack. And just before the show, we were chatting that the estimate that I've seen is that this labor contract is going to cost at about $800-900 of cost to a vehicle. Right. And when you compare that to the average MSRP of $48,000, $900 is not even 2%, right? So yes, right. On paper, $900 is not immaterial, but it's 2% of the average MSRP. And we were just quickly doing the math on a 72-month loan. It's $10-12 a month, so it's not I don't think it's going to have a huge detriment to auto sales, but certainly a cause for concern. And I think that it's going to be very interesting to see, not to take this back onto the strike, but to see, it's clear that Sean Fain and the UAW's vision is to try to put more pressure on these plants, down where I am in Tennessee and some of these non-unionized states, and to try to see how that all plays out. And I believe that some of these automakers are already making preemptive concessions to their workers.
Yeah, this was predicted, and it's going to happen. We saw a story out of Toyota. They're immediately raising salaries. Everybody's going to raise their salary, and it's going to put more cost in the vehicle for everybody. And I think that that's going to cause people to, at the margins, there's going to be fewer vehicles sold. It's just microeconomics. When the price goes up, the sales go down, and it means people will hold their vehicles longer. The good news is vehicles can be held longer. I mean, we grew up in an age where after 2 or 3 or 4 years, you had to replace your car. You didn't have a ride to work. That's just no longer the case. So I think you'll see people holding their vehicles longer.
That's why I was
Nancy, just to follow back up on your question on incentives, I have to say that one of the craziest commercials that I didn't expect to see was about 2 weeks ago. I saw a Ford F-150 ad for $2,500 plus 3.9% financing. I was thinking, it's sort of wild to think that in a moment of this labor strike that we're still out there promoting deals and offers on vehicles like that.
Excellent point. Yeah, I was thinking some of the ones, F-150 Silverado are such hot vehicles. I was wondering some of the ones that perhaps they can't move off the lots. If you saw certainly the Detroit 3 helping the dealers out a bit with some of those incentives.
Yeah, like I said, the incentives just across the board is about half of what we were pre-pandemic, but it's definitely been creeping up. And I think my take is that the industry is actually, I always say that COVID was actually a health event that made the auto industry probably healthier. We sold a few less cars, but we got rid of all these bad habits of creating all these crazy programs to, what a lot of these companies had to do to unload that volume in terms of the fleet volume, these insane lease offers that were done, created a lot of pain on the residual side of the business. And so it's my take that many of these auto executives would probably say, I would prefer a 15 million unit SAR with $48,000 average MSRPs than the good old days of selling 17.5 million at 35,000. That's my impression.
But do you think that they'll keep that discipline?
Well, that's always been the $1 million question, right? And then one of my favorite lines is, you're only as good as your dumbest competitor. And so if one guy gets carried away and starts overproducing and starts putting aggressive offers out there in a particular segment, that can certainly put pressure on the other competitors. But for the time being, it looks like most brands are keeping incentives, certainly tame compared to what it used to be.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to that hot EV topic. The OEMs across the planet are just shoveling money into this. So where is this going to go in reality?
Yeah, I feel like in the last, say, 3-4 weeks, and I know you all are students of the industry, so you're reading and seeing the same stuff that I'm seeing, but I almost feel like there's been this moment of reset around the expectations for electric vehicle adoption. And I think that it's been very clear, as the day supply on these EVs has certainly risen, the situation on the margin, not just for the OEMs, where, I saw a recent study that says that Ford loses about $60,000 in every Mach-E they sell. And then you layer on an additional $20,000 worth of government subsidy between the money that's given to the consumer and the money that's given to the manufacturer. So it's crazy to think that, as a Ford electric car drives by, we just saw $80,000 worth of capital evaporate before our eyes. I don't think that that's a sustainable business model for anybody. So I think there's sort of a reckoning that's happening right now as these auto executives are saying we need to maybe tap the brakes a little bit on this hard charge to electrification. The challenge of this is that this was never ever a consumer driven thing. This was always a government driven thing. And really the Biden administration accelerated that by lifting these CAFE standards from 32 miles per gallon to 51 miles per gallon in a 3-year period. And I just don't think that was ever realistic to think that these car companies would be able to improve their fuel economy by 60% in a 3-year period. I mean, this is not, intellectually honest thinking. And so what's going to happen is that these car companies are going to be faced with penalties to the tune of about $150 for every 1 mile per gallon they fall below the standard, multiplied by the number of vehicles they sell. So in a recent analysis I saw, by 2026, they're saying General Motors would be staring at about a $6 billion fine. Stellantis, they had estimated around $3.5 billion. So the government means serious business on this issue. But I think, as an industry and as our policymakers have to have a more balanced view of this, because the last thing we want to do is to terminate the American car business. And I think there's real risk there today. And I don't want to be an alarmist saying that the car business is going to go away, but I do think that it's not the role of government to try to actually, put a massive financial burden on one of our industries where this climate change situation, I've seen a study that says that automobiles contribute about 13% of greenhouse emissions. So within the transportation sectors, it's not just cars, you've got airplanes, you've got trains, you've got all these other elements of transportation that contribute to that. And so it just seems to me like this greenhouse emissions challenge is a much, much bigger, complicated thing than the car business. But it sure seems to me, and obviously I love the car business, it seems like a lot of the focus has been around placing mandates and requirements to drive this adoption that we're clearly seeing as not being driven by consumers at this time.
But to what extent do you think that part of this goes to the OEMs? I mean, it seems to me that if we look back when, say, Chevy introduced the Bolt a few years ago, that, they started this 0, 0, 0 thing, we're going to have zero emissions. Now, that wasn't because they were being mandated to do that. It was because they thought, hey, this will be a differentiator. This will be an advantage to us in the market. Bill Ford Jr. has long, as Doron probably knows better than anyone, has long been an environmentalist. And so that played right into what his interests are. So it almost seems to me that it isn't entirely the government, that in large part it was, the traditional three saying, hey, how can we get an advantage in a new space?
But I don't think that anybody would say, just very quickly, Gary, that the Chevy Bolt or the Nissan Leaf or some of the early iterations of electric vehicles had wild commercial success. I mean, I think the Bolt has come on here recently. It was interesting. The best Bolt sales happened after they said that they were going to cancel the Bolt, right? So I don't know that those were home run, big profit generators for Nissan, General Motors, or some of the other small EV vehicles that were put out in the market. But we'll go ahead, Doron. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's an excellent point, particularly what you said, Gary, about a misreading of the consumer market. I think it's not just government mandate. I think it's a government mandate that's in combination with the companies themselves misreading what people prioritize in terms of what they want from their vehicles. Tesla, its success was envied by everybody, partly because of what it did technologically as a vehicle, but also partly because of what it did to its stock price. And one of the things that's really caused a lot of Detroit executives to be kind of in a permanent funk is the fact that nobody wants to buy their stock. I mean, General Motors now is selling for 28 and change. It went public 13 years ago at 33. I mean, who keeps their job when the stock does that in 13 years? It's crazy.
Yeah.
But you know, they say the voters are never wrong and the stock market is never wrong, right? And so the stock market has kind of made its judgment about what the future of the Detroit 3 is. And unless they change, I don't see them remaining viable for the long term. I really don't, because I think they paid. I think they.
Because
sorry.
that's how I felt too. I'm glad to hear you say that. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were done.
Well, no, it's okay. But I mean, they painted themselves in a corner with trucks, and now they've spent all this money on electrics, which is people don't want. And I don't really see how you get out of this.
Well, there's the infrastructure too. That I mean, there just isn't. You know, we had this conversation before we started in on this. Seminar, but you know, the infrastructure isn't there. I used to live in Texas, that everybody knows has their own power grid. It was going down every other day. And, you know, is it feasible to have, you know, 90% of the people with EVs if the power grid doesn't work properly in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody's asking these questions. I just finished a report for Seeking Alpha on BYD, which is a very interesting company. And Warren Buffett had been watching this company since the early 2000s and then finally bought into it in 2008 and owned about 20% of BYD. Now Berkshire Hathaway is selling some shares, and people are starting to wonder, what does this mean? Have they become disenchanted with BYD? I don't think they become disenchanted with BYD. I think they like it as much as ever. He has his own methodology for when he feels a share has become overvalued and it's time to take some profits off the table. But I don't think he's disenchanted with the company, and I'm very impressed with the company. I saw their new vehicles in Munich, and then I read that they were at the Tokyo, I think it's the Japan Mobility Show, which used to be the Tokyo Motor Show. And this was a very interesting event for a Chinese car maker to display their wares, because that had never happened before. I mean, the Chinese have a long memory about what happened in the last century, and they have not been in Japan. They now feel like they could go to Japan, and it's a newer generation, and I think they're going to be successful.
So Damon, one of the interesting things, just quick, Doron, on the China automakers that I think is just an absolute mind-blowing thing to try to wrap your brain around is that they say that on a typical year, these companies that build these massive vessels that will transport cars around the oceans and around the globe, the typical year there will be an order of about 5 vessels collectively across from all car companies. The total number of these things built is 5. Last year, Chinese car companies put in bids for 170 new vessels. So I think that speaks to their ambitions to take these Chinese developed electric cars and ship them out to markets across the globe.
And irony of ironies, do you know how much CO2 these vessels put into the atmosphere?
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen any of the numbers? Take a guess how much a typical cargo carrier today puts out in terms of pollution expressed in numbers of cars for a year, what would you think the number would be?
Thousands.
50 million cars. In other words,
Wow.
one of those carriers operating for a year puts out the same emissions as 50 million cars in a year. And part of the reason is because they burn bunker fuel. They burn the dirtiest, filthiest, scummiest hydrocarbon that can be burned in their engines. So I don't know what the point is of shipping electric cars around the world and emitting those kinds of emissions. I don't get it.
So along those lines, in light of what we're talking about now, and also, Brian, what you were saying earlier about the kind of soft organic market for EVs at the moment and the profitability challenges that you have for a Mach-E or whatever, how big of a factor do you guys think how big of a fire is lit under American OEMs at the prospect of we have to stay competitive with emerging technology? Do we want to hand over to China supremacy in, battery, raw materials, mining, and production? Do you think that's a legitimate concern, or is that overstated at this point?
No, I mean, I think that's a totally legitimate concern, but it's not even. I mean, I think from what I've read, Doron, sounds like you're on top of this topic very close, but China absolutely dominates the supply chain. And they, back in 2008, 2009, they got a huge head start on American companies in terms of pursuing the development of battery technology. And so I think something of the magnitude of 90% of the refinement of the rare earth minerals that go into these batteries is processed in China, and they've got a massive cost advantage. And I know that there was the partnership in Detroit, in Michigan, I should say, with Ford and the CATL, I believe is a battery technology company out of China. And there was some question as to whether or not that did or didn't qualify for Inflation Reduction Act. So I think this is like a very, very complicated situation when you consider that the government on one side is enacting these policies and these massive programs to drive EV adoption and to drive domestic production, while simultaneously dealing with the realities of the geopolitical situation, that there's probably no bigger challenge to America right now than China. And they clearly are far and away the leaders when it comes to battery development and the rare earth refinement that goes into those batteries.
So more to the ground truth that we're seeing. So Brian, one of the things that I know you know a lot about is dealers. And so I was looking, and back in 2020, approximately 150 Cadillac dealers said, give us a buyout because we don't want to sell EVs. And that was about 17% of their dealers. Then in 2022, about 3,000 Ford dealers signed up for EV sales, or to do EV sales. I've got that wrong. Basically, 36% of their dealers said they didn't want to sell EVs. They still sell vehicles, but not EVs. Isn't this a message that whether it's at the top end of Cadillac or Ford, more mainstream, that the dealers are saying this is not something that they want to be part of?
Yeah, great point. So I think there's a couple of thoughts. One of which is, and you all probably saw the headline in Automotive News earlier this summer, that the survey that 66% of American car dealers said that they did not have an EV in stock, and 45% of American car dealers said they didn't want an EV in stock. So I think that's a challenge, right? We're never going to, the Biden administration has set a target by 2032 that America is going to be at 67% EV consumption. Today, we're at about 6%. So for us to have a 10, 11-fold improvement, we would certainly need to bring the dealers along for the ride to make that happen. And I think there's a lot of questions as to why that's not happening. The first of which is, in the case of Ford, if I was going to be a Ford dealer that was going to be a seller of electric vehicles, I think there was a couple different programs, but one of which would cost me roughly $1 million out of pocket just to get the charging infrastructure built at my store and to the tools that were required and the training and whatnot that goes on. And so $1 million is not an insignificant amount of money for a car dealer that says, my gosh, I'm only selling 3 or 4 electric vehicles a month, and now I'm being asked to invest $1 million in infrastructure. Like, I think that's a tough sell. And then on the flip side, I think one of the other challenges is that as many of these car manufacturers have looked at Tesla and their seamless, frictionless buying process of no haggle, and it's very simple. And I get it. I don't blame them for wanting to adopt that approach. And so what they, I think had visions of enacting was to say, we're going to sell these electric cars with no haggle, but then we're going to pay you all this below the line money. And in one OEM's case, it was about 7 or 8 different buckets of money, where it's very, very complicated to even understand how much profit didn't I make on this electric vehicle sale, because the system that had been acted was so complicated. So I think those are a couple of the big headwinds of why dealers are not more enthusiastic about doing this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, where the rubber hits the road is when the consumer is knocking on the door saying, hey, I want this Ford Lightning, let's go. And my sense is when you talk to dealers that this is not what they're seeing from their consumer firsthand.
I have to get involved in this because we've published extensively on this, and I couldn't agree more, Brian. I mean, I've been asked several times, well, is there some ulterior motive that the dealers won't sell EVs? And I said, no. The motive is that they just can't get people who want them. There are other motives too. I mean, certainly with the technician shortage now and having to invest so much in the infrastructure and service to get ready for the EVs, salespeople are used to selling the ICE vehicles. It's a whole learning process that they're going through with EVs. And I think Brian's absolutely on point with the investments they're making. Where is the payoff on this? I had a New York City major dealer there say to me, even if people want them in New York, we can't. I mean, what are they going to do? How are they going to charge them? Run an extension cord up 20 stories? I mean, the charging, and I keep saying the same thing, and I apologize, but the infrastructure just isn't there.
Well, and one other key point on the dealer dynamic that I think causes a challenge is that we are coming out of this amazing 2 or 3 year run where new vehicles are being sold at full sticker or above. Sales consultants for the longest time have been paid a percentage of gross. And at Cox Automotive, we analyze the gross margins on these different vehicles. And largely speaking, the electric vehicles across all brands tend to have the lowest grosses as we sit here today. So if I'm a salesperson that's trying to feed my family and pay my mortgage and take my kids on vacation, I have my choice of selling an ICE vehicle where I can maybe make a percentage gross on a $4,000 or $5,000 home run, or take a loss on an electric car. I think that there's probably a certain amount of that going on as well. And so it's just a very, very difficult situation for the car manufacturers because they don't have a lot of margin to play with, but it certainly doesn't help matters when the people on the front lines would be asked to make significantly less than what they could make by steering those customers to more of a traditional vehicle.
That's an excellent point, and one I've had dealer principals talk to me about and have said to me, I'm a little worried for my new salespeople. This was during the chip crisis, because they think that it's always going to be like this. They can just take orders, and people are willing to pay, an extra $10,000 in, an extra $10,000, an extra $15,000, plus a lot of accessories. And it's just not how it works. And now with the EVs coming in, your point's well taken.
Well, a lot of that was happening, Nancy, because people were getting checks from the government. Let's face it. Yes. I mean, there was a lot of people weren't working, and people were just getting cash in from the government, and they were being told they didn't even have to pay taxes on it. So that's all over. And now we're trying to figure out how to pay back all the money we borrowed in order to send those people those checks. And that's what goes back to what I was talking before about debt and why these dealers, who are really the savviest people in our business, let's face it, these guys have to make and girls have to make a payroll every month. They're interested in making money. They know what sells and doesn't sell. I've always said that while people working for the OEMs are very smart, strictly speaking, they're not business people. they're corporate executives, corporate managers. They don't really have to get a return on what it is that they do. The dealers have to get a return on what they do. So it's very important to listen to what they say, because they have really the closest touch with the customer, the consumer, the ability to pay. I mean, these are the people who really know what's going on.
Excellent point, and it brings it all full circle, really, what we've been talking about, the pent-up demand. People don't have the extra money now. After coming out of the pandemic, people weren't taking vacations. As you said, people weren't spending, and they were getting a lot of extra money.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we really do have a cyclical economy, and everybody's looking for the next recession. It will come. There's no question. Everybody knows that. If you're a grown-up and you've been through a couple of these, you know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
So you get ready for it.
Yeah.
So Brian, when do you think it would be a good time for someone to buy a new vehicle?
Well, that's a great question. I tell you, if you were in the market for an electric vehicle, I think that the used EV market is going to provide some really interesting opportunities for people. We just saw an analysis recently of vehicles that were sold at about $60,000 18 months ago are going through our auctions around $26,000, $27,000. So think about that. That's a 45% residual in 18 months. Which speaks to, that is scary to think about. So I think that if I was a value shopper out in the marketplace today, a used EV might not be a bad place to start. But I think the other challenge, is Damon and I were talking about earlier with that entry SUV track segment, is just that the day supply there is very, very tight, and that consumers are just very boxed in right now. Used car values are very high. There's really tight availability on the new car space on the cheaper prices. And so, the byproduct of all of this is that the American consumer has been holding on to their cars longer. I think the average age of the new car is the oldest that it's ever been, roughly 12 years, give or take. And companies like Pep Boy and AutoZone and these part suppliers have never made more money in their lives.
Right. That's right.
We actually have we have a little bit of data on that. So, new EV vehicles year over year, our Cars.com research shows that demand is down 10.7%, but used EV demand up almost 74% year over year. So that, backs up what you were just saying.
So, but Damon, do you have any sense of whether, it's safe, as it were, for people to buy used EVs? I mean, everybody can, take their used, if they're interested in an ICE vehicle, they can take it to a mechanic. Mechanic can look at it and say, this is good, this is bad, buy it. But the battery seems to be a mystery.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we're still in the early stages of that. There's a company called Recurrent that kind of tracks long-term battery health, and boy, that's going to be interesting to watch over the next 5-10 years, just to see how all that shakes out as we get to these early EVs, the first of the Leafs, even the first of the second generation Leafs and the early Bolts. What are these things going to look like 10, 15 years down the road?
What the typical 18-month residual value is on an ICE vehicle versus a typical 18-month residual on an EV?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that the typical residual on a 36-month for sure is roughly in the mid 50s. So to put that into context, but probably on an 18-month vehicle, you'd probably be closer to like 75% of the initial value is still there, where these EVs are closer to 45%, roughly speaking.
So that would be all by itself. If you're really thinking about an EV purchase, that all by itself would be a deterrent to getting an EV. Another one, along with infrastructure, like you say, Nancy, and price and everything else, it's like, oh my God, it's going to be I'll have less equity in this thing when I sell it.
Totally. And then if you look at, I don't see the Tesla distribution between lease and retail. But of the non-Tesla EV players, we're seeing lease penetration rates around 70%, while the ICE average right now is maybe 17%. I think for two reasons, one of which is the EV tax credit is simpler on a lease. And then number two is you don't have to bear that residual risk in the future, to your point.
Yeah.
So basically, it's either really a good time to buy a used EV or really a bad time to buy a used EV, depending on your.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think it's a horrible time to buy a used EV. I mean, I think that if you were, to answer your question, Gary, I don't want to be the dead horse, but if you were looking for the best value in the marketplace right now, I go try to find the 2-year-old used EV, and I think you probably, I mean, the technology of these cars is amazing, and they have, I have to say, largely these vehicles all look great, they drive great. They're quiet. They're fun to drive. And I think for the value shopper that's out there, that's where the game is to be won.
Okay. Well, with that, our hour's up, come to a close. So Brian Finkelmeyer of Cox Automotive, thank you very much for joining us. Nancy, Damon, Doron, it's been great. Appreciate all of your help on the show today. And so we'll be back next week. So thanks all for watching.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the AutoLine channel.